Hey everyone, welcome in. We'll just give folks a moment to filter in and then we will get started. Excellent. We've got folks just filtering in. We had over just about 500 folks planning to join us. So we're up to almost 200. So we'll give folks just one more minute to filter in before we kick things off. And the chat is open, so please feel free to say hi if you'd like to say hi in the chat, maybe where you're zooming in from, and we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us today. Beautiful day here in the Bay Area in California. I hope it's lovely wherever you're zooming in from. I see Chicago, Nevada, Virginia, all over the country. I'm Gaby Goldstein. I'm one of our co-founders here at Sister District, where our mission is to build progressive power in our state legislatures. And we do this by electing great candidates. We do it by helping lawmakers succeed once they're in office. We do it by conducting actionable research on state legislative voting and policy issues. And we do it by shifting the narrative towards a more positive conception of progressive state power through media and storytelling. And so I'm really excited to be joined on this briefing by our very own head of research, Jillian Evans, and lead analyst at our partners Data for Progress, Isa Alomran. And we're thrilled to gather this diverse, as I said, just about 500 RSVPs. We've a diverse group of researchers, activists, volunteers, funders, lawmakers, friends and allies from progressive organizations and others to come together and share the results of this first of its kind research and survey exploring down-ballot roll-off. So as a quick overview for the agenda for today, I'm first just going to give us a background about this project. What brought us to explore ballot roll-off? How did we become really sure that this was a significant hindrance to building democratic state legislative power? And why did we then decide to embark on this qualitative and quantitative project with Data for Progress? And then after that, Isa will provide some methodological grounding for us in terms of the qualitative work we did with focus groups and then the quantitative survey that we ran. Then Jillian, our head of research, will walk us through some top-line findings from this work. And then I'll come back to provide some key takeaways, some emergent themes coming from this work, and situate it where we are in this larger project that we are deeply embedded in, which is turning the tide around in terms of ballot roll-off. And we'll talk about ways that you all can partner with us on this work. And finally, we should have some time for Q&A, a couple of housekeeping items. There are closed captions available. We'll include the instructions in the chat. Please do ask questions along the way. We will try to answer them in the chat if we can. And if we don't have time to answer them during this briefing, please follow up with us. We'll include our email. And we will include the deck and our top line memo in an email to all of you who RSVP'd after this call. So no worries, please don't worry about screenshotting the deck. We'll get that all out to you either later today or tomorrow. So let's kick things off. For the past several years, our research team here at Sister District has been investigating an issue that we have come to understand is a serious impediment to building progressive state power, and that's down-ballot roll-off. But let's take a step back. Why do we even care about down-ballot races at all? Why are we here talking about down-ballot stuff? So my co-founders and I started this organization in late 2016 because we saw a gap in organizing capacity and resources going to progressive folks running for and then serving at the state legislative level. These are really critically overlooked venues of power for the left. our state houses increasingly serve as battlegrounds for very different views for the future of this country, right? Increasingly contrasting visions of the future. And those are issues that scholars like Jake Grumbach and Heather Gerken and Alex Hurdle Fernandez have been exploring for a long time, right? The idea that our states are where the battles for the future of our country are increasingly happening. So, in other words, states are the sleeping giants of policy, and frankly, progressives are tardy to the party or late to attend to building power at this level. And of course, conservatives have been quite masterful at this for, frankly, generations, right? And we'll see that some of the results of that in our survey in a certain way, really weaponizing states and state policy for their own regressive policy goals. And of course, today's revanchist Supreme Court is a direct consequence of those efforts. And we see a central goal there in the court's conservative jurisprudence, the narrowing of federal protections and the expansion of state power. And we see that all over the place. But of course, can't just be against things. We are, in fact, for things. And there are so many ways in which our blue states are showing us what's possible when progressives control our states. So many examples. Every day, the trifecta in Michigan does something incredible. From repealing right to work and all the rest. And here in California, where I am, we have our state establishing the Abortion Practical Support Fund and so much more. So we have this tremendous opportunity to build power at the state level, to expand our imagination about what states can be for us, towards what we could call perhaps an interdependent federalism, right? The idea that we need our states and our federal levels to operate and be healthy and thrive in order to achieve any of the progressive goals we want at any level of government. Well, okay, great. Let's go win state legislative races, right? Let's put those seats in chambers. Yes, off to the races, but it's not so easy, right? And as we started doing this work, we started to notice a few things in the results of the elections that we were working on. First off, we noticed that these races, these state legislative and down ballot races, are won and lost by tiny, tiny margins, right? Everyone remember Shelley Simons in 2017 in Virginia? It was we had this briefing, and this research was covered this morning by Politico, and they included a picture of the ceramic bowl where Shelley Simons, who tied in her race, the entire lower chamber in Virginia hung in the balance. She tied in the way that Virginia settles the tiebreakers to pick your name out of a ceramic bowl. Wasn't her name, that came out of the bowl. I had never seen the ceramic bowl. It was nice to see it in print. But truly, we see this year in, year out, where not just seats, but entire chambers rise and fall by these tiny margins, right? In 2021, Democrats lost the entire Virginia lower chamber by 750 votes, right? In 2022, Democrats flipped the entire Pennsylvania House with 63 votes in one seat, right? And just shout out, I know Arizona is on a lot of people's minds. Let's not forget that Chris Mays, the Attorney General, she won that race with 280 votes out of 2.5 million votes cast, right? So these tiny, tiny margins. But we also noticed that a lot of the time there was a really big gap between the top of the ticket vote totals and state legislative candidates, specifically Democrats. Sometimes 500,000 or more votes, would be a gap between there, and so we began to think, what's going on there? If just some of those voters could be persuaded to vote down ballot, could we close some gaps all across the board? So this is what led us to study ballot roll-off. What is roll-off? Well, it's when a voter picks the top but not the bottom of their ballot. And we didn't know, we could see it happening in the races that we supported. We didn't know how widespread it was. So we did our own research. Unfortunately, there's not much out there on this in the academy or in industry, surprisingly little on ballot roll-off. So we did our own research, and what we found was that state leg candidates from both major parties do experience ballot roll-off, but down ballot Dems experience it much more frequently and severely than Republicans. So we link here to a study that we published in 2022, looking across 8 battleground states over 8 years. And what we found was that contested state leg Dems, folks running against a Republican, experience ballot roll-off 80% of the time, compared to less than 40% of the time for Republicans. So we saw this significant partisan skew that was really widespread. But so what? Does it matter? Would it really impact election outcomes if we reduced ballot roll-off? Would it take a ton of energy and votes to make a difference at all? So again, we did our own research on this, and it turns out it would not take much to drastically change the outcomes at the state legislative level if we could just curb ballot roll-off just a little bit. So for instance, in 2020, Democrats could have gained control of 14 chambers in 9 states if they had just decreased ballot roll-off by 2% or less. And those votes could have come from people who did go out and vote for Joe Biden, but they skipped their state leg candidates on their ballot. So let's look at a couple of quick examples. Arizona House in 2020. Democrats would have needed 4,400 votes approximately to flip the 2 seats needed. Over 500,000 more people voted for Joe Biden than down-ballot Democrats. So if just 0.8% of the people who did get out to vote for Joe Biden had voted for their Democratic state house candidate too, they would have won the chamber. Tiny, tiny little pieces. Virginia House in 2021, we mentioned this a little bit. Democrats lost the majority by about 750 votes. 64,000 more people went out and voted for Terry McAuliffe for governor than voted for down-ballot Democrats that year. So again, if just 1% of them had voted for their state house candidate, we would have held the majority. So just to recap what we knew going into this project. We knew that from our research that we've done before, we knew that ballot roll-off is more frequent and more severe for Democrats than Republicans. We knew that roll-off affects state legislative outcomes at both the district and the chamber level, and we knew that just decreasing it a little bit could result in massive gains. So then the question is, okay, but which voters roll off and why do they vote off? Why do they roll off? So to get at that question, we partnered with Data for Progress to conduct the qualitative and quantitative research that you're going to hear about. So with that, I will turn things over to Isa to share some details about the methodology of this project. And then Jillian will share some top lines. And again, I'll come back and pull together some threads into some themes after that. So thank you so much. And I'll turn things over to Isa.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gaby, for that great introduction and table setting and context. It's very important, and I'm glad that people are engaging with it. My name is Isa Alomran. I'm a lead analyst at Data for Progress. And over the past few months, my team and I have had the pleasure and the privilege of working together with Gaby, Jillian, and other folks at the Sister District team to conduct research into voter-level factors that may help influence or inform roll-off behavior. Specifically, we conducted both qualitative and quantitative research to better understand factors like demographics, individual level political knowledge, perceptions of state power, and how those factors may influence whether or not people vote down ballot. Our first phase of research consisted of 4 focus groups where we recruited 25 participants from Arizona, California, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And those participants were grouped by ideology. So we had 2 groups consisting of liberal voters, one being liberal down ballot voters, and then the second being liberal roll-off voters. And then we had that same exact setup for 2 conservative groups, so conservative roll-off voters and conservative down ballot voters. These focus groups, 4, were conducted across a 2-week period in October 2023. And based on the findings of that research, we moved on to the second phase of our research project, which was a quantitative survey. So this specifically was a survey of 5,101 likely voters polled across the states of Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and was fielded from November 27th to December 14th, 2023. The sample was weighted to be representative of likely voters by age, gender, education, race, geography, and voting history. And the reason we went with a pooled sample of likely voters here rather than registered voters or even adults across these battleground states was because we wanted to maximize our reach or our ability to reach, I should say, people who have voted in the two most recent major elections, so 2020 and 2022, because we wanted to kind of maximize the number of roll-off voters that we encountered so that we can dig into the little demographics and have a good sense of why roll-off voting occurs, or roll-off behavior, I should say, occurs. Next slide, please. In terms of our sample composition, again, it was weighted to be representative of likely voters pooled across these battleground states. And so it'll be less diverse by age, gender, and even college education than if it were registered voters or if it were adults. But overall, 53% of our sample was female, 47% was male, 65% were 45 and older, 35% were under 45, 66% did not hold a college degree, while 34% did. 74% of our sample was white, 10% was Black or African American, and 8% were Latino. 34% of our sample identified as Democrats, 30% as independents or third-party voters, 36% as Republicans, and 26% were liberal, 37% moderate, and 38% conservative. And then onto the variable of interest here, 74% of our sample were down-ballot voters, 15% were sometimes down-ballot voters and sometimes roll-off voters, and then 10% were roll-off voters. If you have any specific questions about our methodology, including how we sample voters, how we reach voters, and how we weight our sample, I'll be dropping a link to our methodology webpage on the Data for Progress website. And I'll also drop my email in the chat. Feel free to email me or drop any questions in the chat, and I'll be around for the remainder of the presentation to answer any specific questions that y'all might have. And then with that, I'll hand it off to Jillian.
That was a very helpful overview, Isa. Thank you for taking us through the research methods and helping to set that foundation for the results of the survey, which we'll dive into now. And we want to cover a lot of important and really interesting findings in this section. So I just want to give everyone a quick roadmap before I get started of what's to come in this part of the presentation. So first things first, in these results, we'll be focusing on the comparison between two main groups of voters in our survey, roll-off voters and down-ballot voters. Roll-off voters are those who said that they rarely or never vote in state legislative races. Specifically, down-ballot voters said that they usually or always vote in these races. And so I'll note that the middle category of respondents who said that they sometimes vote in state legislative races are not included in the comparisons here, just in order for us to give the clearest read on the results. And specifically what I mean is that the critical issue for us was to understand roll-off voters. And we found that it was most helpful to look not just at their responses to the survey, but actually to compare them against their counterparts who say that they are voting down the ballot, and really home in on the points of contrast between these two opposite groups. And so with that framing in mind, I'm going to cover the differences between roll-off and down-ballot voters, first in terms of their demographics, and then I'll review how they differ in terms of knowledge, their attitudes and behaviors. And last, I'll highlight some key differences that we observed between liberals and conservatives within that roll-off voters group. So we'll start by going over the demographic patterns. So compared to down-ballot voters, roll-off voters are more likely to be, first of all, women. So 12% of women in our survey said that they roll off, compared to 7% of respondents who are men. And conversely, 81% of men in our survey said that they are down-ballot voters, compared to just 68% of women who said the same. Regarding race and ethnicity, those who identify with a racial or ethnic category other than white are more likely to roll off, 14% of Black respondents, 12% of Latinos say that they roll off, compared to 8% of white respondents. And looking again at the flip side of that question, 77% of white respondents said that they are down ballot voters, compared to smaller percentages among Black and Latino voters. Next thing, you'll notice there's a pretty large age difference in roll-off behavior. 17% of respondents younger than 45 say that they roll off, compared to only 6% who are 45 and older. And notably, 83% of our respondents over the age of 45 said that they are down ballot voters, which is a pretty striking difference from 59% of respondents in the younger age group who said that they vote all the way down the ballot. There is also a pretty striking difference by educational level. 12% of respondents without a college degree say that they roll off, compared to just 5% of those who have a college degree. And again, this huge note, 85% of college educated respondents in our survey are down ballot voters. Right. And the last of our standard demographics that I want to talk about is ideology. And we want to highlight this result for a few reasons. First, just to note that we did use a couple of different questions in the survey to measure roll-off behavior. One for state legislative races specifically, that's our main measure and the one that we've been talking about so far. And then there's this question here, which asked more generally, just how often do you vote in every race on your ballot? And looking at the ends of the ideological spectrum here, we see that 52% of very conservative respondents say they always vote in every race, compared to a smaller percentage of their liberal counterparts, 46%. And a pattern that we did notice in the survey is that there's frequently a distinction between moderates and those on the ideological extremes, but there are also results like this one, showing the differences between liberals and conservatives, and we're going to dig into some more of these differences later in the presentation. All right, so now we'll just dig a little deeper into the demographic patterns with a couple results. We took a sort of combined look at education intersected with race, and we see that the racial differences in roll-off are larger among voters without college degrees. So only 11% of white respondents without college roll off. 16% of Black and Latino respondents without college are roll-off voters. And for those with college degrees, roll-off, as we've seen, is low overall in this group, and really not that different by race. So 4% college-educated white respondents and 6% of Black college-educated respondents roll off. Right. And next, we'll take a combined look at ideology intersected with age. And we see evidence here similarly for a stronger association between ideology and roll-off among younger respondents than compared to older respondents. And so for voters under 45, we see 24% of moderates in this age group roll off, compared to just 9% of ideologues, so very liberals and very conservatives, where, again, if we switch to the older voters group, roll-off percentages generally very low and really don't differ that much by ideology, certainly not to the extent that we see with among younger voters. So now we're gonna shift from talking about demographic patterns to exploring differences in exploring differences between roll-off and down ballot voters, in terms of their knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. And there's a lot of good stuff here, starting with knowledge of what state legislators do. So we asked respondents to identify from a set of options what the main role or job of state legislators is. And I'll say up front that knowledge about what state legislators do is generally low. So only 50% of our whole sample answered correctly that, legislators' main job is to write and pass the state's laws. But this knowledge, we noticed, is also much lower for roll-off voters. Only 31% of them answered correctly, compared to the over half of down-ballot voters who were able to give the correct answer here. And we also included a knowledge item around the highly salient issue of abortion. We wanted to see if voters are aware of the significant power that states have over abortion policy right now. And again, overall knowledge of states' authority in this area is also low. About 40% answered that state governments currently have more influence than the federal government in this area. But again, it persists. This knowledge is lower among roll-off voters, especially compared to down-ballot voters, 32 to 43%. And we also asked a question about confidence in knowledge, specifically as it relates to making a choice between state legislative candidates. And here, almost 80% of roll-off voters in our survey agreed that they feel like they don't know enough to decide between candidates in these races, compared to just 42% of down-ballot voters who said the same. In a similar vein, we asked respondents if a fear of voting the wrong way or potentially voting for the wrong candidate has ever kept them from voting in a state legislative race. And only 23% of roll-off voters said that this concern has often prevented them from voting, compared with just 9% of down-ballot voters. And then we also asked a question about whether your vote matters in state legislative elections specifically. And more roll-off voters, 56%, agreed that their vote for a state legislative candidate specifically doesn't matter, and whether they vote or not will not affect the outcome, compared to about half as many, 24% of down-ballot voters who say the same. And so we know that state legislative races are won, and whole chambers can be flipped by tiny vote margins, but roll-off voters are not thinking about it that way. Okay. All right. So roll-off voters compared to down-ballot voters also have a different view of state versus federal government power. So a smaller percentage of roll-off voters believe that state governments should have the most authority to make decisions about important issues, compared to a much higher number, 63% of down-ballot voters who think that states should have the most authority. And the split on this question between roll-off and down-ballot voters is really consistent with the ideological split in the overall sample. We found that roughly 40% of liberal respondents said that state government should have the most authority, while that number is perhaps unsurprisingly almost twice as high among conservatives, 76%. So very different views on state versus federal power. And so in keeping with that last question, we also asked respondents to rank federal, state, and local elections according to which ones feel most important to them. And interestingly here, roll-off and down-ballot voters are actually very similar in their rankings. They put federal elections first, and then local elections, followed by state elections last. And so a solid majority, roll-off and down-ballot voters alike, say federal elections are most important. Then there's a pretty big drop off. But actually, about 22% of voters say that local elections rank first in importance. And then the smallest number are putting state elections first in importance. And so what we take from this is that, very few voters are seeing state elections as important. And this is consistent with what we heard from our focus group participants as well. Actually, there is a donut-shaped problem here, where federal matters and local matters tend to feel most relevant and immediate to people, but state government and state issues are really falling into sort of a gap between those two. Okay, all right, so now we'll shift gears a little and talk about a few findings around news consumption. There is another pretty stark gap here where with only 20% of roll-off voters saying that they very often or often pay attention to political news overall, compared to 73% of down-ballot voters who are often following politics. And on state politics news specifically, the gap persists. Again, small number, 22% of roll-off voters say that they are, seeing and hearing news stories about state politics in particular, compared with 59% of down-ballot voters. Okay, and finally, we want to just briefly touch on differences in preferred news sources as well. Down-ballot voters, we see, tend to get their news from traditional media, local television news, broadcast news. They're following these sources, relying on these sources much more than roll-off voters who tend to get their news from online sources instead. And these differences that we see in media habits here really align with age differences in the sample. Older respondents, who are also the ones, voting all the way down the ballot for the most part, they more frequently report getting their news from local or broadcast TV outlets, while younger respondents, again, perhaps not surprising, typically say that they get their news from social media or online sources instead. Okay. And last, we asked a behavioral question about voting methods, and specifically whether you vote in person or voted by mail in the last election, the last time you voted. And we see a couple of things here. So roll-off voters are less likely to vote by mail or absentee, and they're a lot less likely to remember how they voted compared to down-ballot voters. So 23% of roll-off voters said they voted by mail, 32% of down-ballot voters, but really almost as many, 21% of roll-off voters said that they either don't know or can't recall how they voted the last time that they voted, and only 1% of down-ballot voters said that they couldn't remember. And this finding, we think, speaks possibly to a potential intervention, possibly encouraging people to vote by mail, and maybe emphasizing that it allows voters, more time to fill out your ballots, look up information. It's not as easy to do those things while you're in the voting booth. Okay. So far we have been focusing on roll-off versus down-ballot voters in these comparisons. In this final section of results, I'm just going to walk us through a few of the important differences between liberal and conservative roll-off voters. All right. Demographically first, a few key patterns we see. Liberal roll-off voters are more likely to be women, while conservatives are more likely to be men. Liberal roll-off voters are also slightly more likely to identify as a race other than white. And third, liberal roll-off voters appear to skew younger than conservative roll-off voters. And then on this same knowledge question that we covered earlier, knowledge of what state legislators do, fewer liberal roll-off voters are able to correctly identify the role of state legislators, 31% of liberals compared to 39% of conservative roll-off voters answered this question correctly. And finally, we asked a pair of questions related to civic duty to see if people agree more that civic duty, means to them voting in every race on the ballot, even if you're not familiar with the candidates, or the opposite, if civic duty really means voting only in races where you feel like you're informed about the candidates. And when presented with these statements, actually more liberal roll-off voters than conservatives agree with the idea that it is their civic duty to vote only in races where they are informed and where they feel like they're familiar with the candidates. All right, and with that, that concludes the presentation of the results, and I'll turn it back over to Gaby to share some key takeaway points from our findings and talk about our next steps.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jillian. And thank you all for the incredible questions in the chat. I'm feverishly trying to respond to as many as I can, but if we don't get to them, please do email. We'll include our emails at the end as well. So I think that was obviously a very quick read through. Jillian, thank you so much for really pulling out, I think teasing out some of the most interesting findings. We will, as I mentioned, share our slides and our top lines memo, which includes more information than we are able to present here, to everyone via email who RSVP'd either later today or tomorrow. So at this point, I want to take a step back and sort of tie some threads together from what we've heard coming out of the survey work. And I think that what's most exciting to me about many of these findings is that they lend themselves toward interventions, or at least avenues to further explore. And that's really the goal here, is to identify actionable pieces of information that we can use in the next phase of this project, which we'll talk about. So here, I'm just going to run through what I see as some emergent themes, a few key and actionable takeaways that really tie together a number of the findings into some groupings. And so the first that I want to mention is the demographic findings. And so it is just very clear in the data that the folks who are most likely to roll off their ballots are women, voters of color, and young voters, period. And I think what's helpful there is that because we know that now, we're able to then delve deeper into these sets of voters to better understand what their needs are, what their goals are, and move towards tailored interventions or messages and frameworks that better address those needs and goals. Of course, these voters, right, women, voters of color, they're not monoliths, right? There's an entire tapestry for each of these demographics. But it's a good starting point to know this at a top level, that these folks are most likely to roll off their ballots. And I should say, we have a lot more information from the survey about these particular demographic groups, and we're happy to discuss and think about ways to deepen that exploration of how to empower and excite these voters to vote down ballot. So we welcome that conversation. So the second sort of actionable piece that I think comes out of this work is around knowledge gaps. So there were a number of findings that Jillian shared that get at this, this central issue around knowledge. And I just wanted to pull a couple out here, just at the biggest, broadest level, right? The first is that voters in general do not know what state legislators do. And, the way that we asked that question, I thought was really interesting. We asked the respondents, who again are likely voters in these battleground states, what state legislators do. And there were a few options. And, overall in the sample, voters are, not, the knowledge is low in the sense that the response that state legislators write and pass the state's laws, that's not very well known. Other responses that were available and chosen include that state legislators represent their state in Congress, and others indicating that knowledge in general is low. But nonetheless, knowledge about what state legislators do is far lower for roll-off voters. And that's quite clear. So there's a big knowledge gap in general among all voters, but it's even larger for folks who roll off their ballots. And it's not just about what state legislators do where there's a knowledge gap, but it's also about what states have authority over, especially issues that are really important to voters, like abortion. So we asked a question specifically to understand if voters understand that states have authority, now have the majority of authority over abortion. And in general, voters don't really know that very much, but far fewer roll-off voters know that. And so, again, I think these data give us avenues to explore around how to increase knowledge. Again, not just knowledge about what state legislatures do, although that's clearly a gap in knowledge, but about how important state legislatures are to the issues that voters care about most, including abortion. So again, what I'm trying to do here is pull out some themes and provide some ideas of next steps. Where do we go from here? So the third that I wanted to mention is around confidence and agency. And so here we see in the data that roll-off voters, they feel they don't know enough to vote for state legislative candidates. They feel concerned about voting for the wrong candidate. They feel their votes in state legislative elections don't matter. And so, these are really, they're humbling findings, right? They're hard, they're tough, right? But they're really useful because they give us opening to explore how to tailor messages and frameworks, how to convey to voters that they do know enough to empower them to vote, even if they don't know everything. And we have a really, I want to talk about the ideological split on this in a little while. And really, I think importantly, to help voters understand that their vote absolutely matters at this level of the ballot, right? One vote in the House of Delegates in 2017, 63 votes flipped the Pennsylvania House in 22, 280 votes, right? Abortion hangs in the balance because of Chris May's win at 280 votes. So again, we see low confidence and agency, but it gives us the opportunity to think about how to empower voters and how to help them feel like they know enough and that their vote really matters. So I want to touch on what Jillian mentioned as sort of a donut hole. I don't know if we have any health policy, other health policy nerds on the line besides me, but we sometimes refer to a donut hole in Medicare and Medicaid coverage. But I think there really is a state legislative donut hole that comes out in many of these findings from this survey. Someone asked earlier in the chat about, well, yeah, people think that federal elections are most important. I don't know what you think, what that shows. What I think is more interesting is not that federal elections matter most to people, it's that local elections matter second and state leg elections matter last. And so that ordering of federal, local, state leg, again, gives us an opportunity to build up a connection to state legislative issues and policies and leaders and all the rest to sort of fill that donut hole. And again, we see this with the news coverage. There was, again, some really humbling figures that Jillian shared there. Very few roll-off voters say that they see news about state politics, right? So if we're trying to get folks interested and empowered and excited to vote down ballot, and they're not seeing anything they don't consume the news that would ever feed them that. I mean, this again goes to this donut hole and speaks, I think, so much to the devastation of local media, the devastation of newsrooms when it comes to covering state issues. But again, as we think about interventions, right, and we have, we have funders on the line and others funding our state newsrooms is a really, really important piece of this puzzle. So I also just want to mention, we had this voting method question on there. Just to reiterate, this survey was really focused on attitudes and behaviors and knowledge, as opposed to understanding how the structural features of voting affect ballot roll-off behavior. There is a separate kind of literature and set of issues related to the structural features, right? Like how long your ballot is, whether you can vote by mail, all the rest. We were really interested in understanding why people roll off, as in terms of their attitudes and knowledge. But we did have this question on voting method, which I think is very interesting, which is very clearly in the data, roll-off voters are less likely to vote by mail or absentee. And so again, it's interesting to think about, if we could get more of our voters onto the vote by mail rolls, could that decrease ballot roll-off as well? So I want to spend a minute talking about what, frankly, is probably my favorite set of findings from this work. Those of you who know me are probably not surprised about this. I did go into this work with some priors around how ideology might impact down ballot voting. And I have to say, many of those were borne out. Some of them were not. And it's interesting in the places where they were or were not borne out. So I pulled together a few themes around this. Again, I think that ideology plays quite a role in down ballot roll-off behavior, especially when you see the stark partisan skew in the outcomes. The first is just that, as we talked about earlier, voters often don't know what the state legislators do, but conservatives vote anyway. Okay, let's just take a step back, right? No, let's just assume no one really knows what state legislators do, but conservatives vote down ballot anyway, even if they don't know. Whereas a lot of our voters, feel, and we have a finding in here, that they should, our voters feel like they should only vote if they really know about the candidate. Not the case on the conservative side. Very interesting, right? Similarly, voters often don't know about their state legislative candidates. This is what I just was saying, right? But conservatives vote anyway, and our voters don't always vote anyway. Here I think it's important to recognize also that liberal roll-off voters, have lower knowledge on some of these issues than conservative roll-off voters, right? And that's something important to think about. This finding we saw in the qual, and it was borne out in the quant. Conservatives feel an urgency about state legislative elections that liberals do not. That's very interesting, right? Given how important state legislative elections and policies are, right? But conservatives do feel an urgency. Very, very interesting. And I think that's connected to this final point, which is around beliefs and values about state and federal power. So we asked this question in a few different ways. Conservatives believe that the state level is where most power should be placed. Not is. This isn't a knowledge question. This is a belief question, right? Like this is a values question. Whereas liberals believe the federal government is where most power should be placed. And that, I think, really gets us to a deep ideological difference between conservatives and liberals or progressives. Here we use the term liberals. On the right, there is it goes back to the Civil War, a deep emotional, ideological connection to states' rights and the idea of states as being the right place for power to be held and wielded. Whereas on the liberal side, we have a very underdeveloped connection to the idea of state. And we see that come through in voting behavior, where our voters don't feel excited or empowered to vote down ballot if they don't know everything, right? Or if they don't think that the state level is the right place for power, and so we see these patterns in roll off. And so I think that there's tremendous opportunity here for interventions at the ideological level to help our voters understand the urgency of state elections, which the conservatives feel, to build a connection to states, right? And to really have that deep-seated emotional feeling about states, which conservatives have and liberals don't. So Just briefly wanted to mention next steps on this project. So this work with Data for Progress has been incredibly helpful for us in better crystallizing for us who voters who roll off their ballots are, and some of the ideas, values, knowledge gaps, media consumption, all of these pieces that go into the behavior we see, which is more liberal roll-off than conservative roll-off. So the next phase of this work is to figure out what to do about it, right? So now we know we have this rich set of information. What are we going to do about it? And so the next step in this process will be to develop messages and identify and test messages that will empower and excite liberals to vote for state legislative candidates, right? And so we highlight their empower and excite because those are really, some of the key pieces that we find coming out of all of this work as ripe for bolstering, right? Our voters do not feel empowered to vote if they don't know everything about a candidate. They don't feel empowered that their vote will matter. And these are all things that we know objectively are not true, but it's how they feel, which gives us the opportunity to empower them and excite them, right? And so here we have all of those findings around, states not being the right place for power, or states not mattering, and all of this. We need to excite our voters to vote down ballot. And there, I think, really huge opportunity to build up the power and promise of states as an ideology, right? To get our voters committed to the idea that building state power is important and necessary to make the progressive gains that we all want at any level of the ballot. So we are in the process now of identifying and testing those messages and doing some replication studies and all the rest to make sure that we really are finding the messages that will move our voters to vote all the way down the ballot. Again, focused on folks who are roll-off voters, right? Really looking at this phase, focused on those folks. And then the goal is to be able to deploy this work in the fall. And we'd love to work in partnership with all of you on that. And please get in touch and let us know how, let us talk about ways that we can disseminate this at scale. We really think that the work we're doing now will be useful for a turnout universe, right? These are folks who are all, who are going to go out and vote for Joe Biden or at the top of their ballots, right? But are likely to not vote down ballot. And so, lots of you on this call will be running turnout programs. I think that this is a really nice complement to a turnout program. Again, the margins that we're working with are so small. Just a little goes a really long way. So with that, I think we have time for a couple of questions. So Jillian and Isa, let's come. Oh, and finally, let me just say, if you have questions that we're not able to answer, please do reach out to us by email, and we'll get there. I saw a couple of questions that I can just flag, and please, if we haven't answered your question in real time, please put it back in the chat for us, and we'll get there. And so I saw a question earlier about whether the sample size is large enough to be statistically significant. Who would like to take that on for our non-interventional survey?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. So yes, the short answer is yes. We feel pretty confident about our ability to take these findings and present the results from them. Specifically, even as we go down, there were some very interesting patterns that we did notice, but where the sample size was a little on the edge. And so we chose not to display this. But anything that was mentioned or discussed during the presentation today, we feel pretty confident about. Both in terms of the sample size being large enough for us to actually make observations that hold statistical value, and so on and so forth.
Great. So there is a question here about rural and urban voting patterns, or voters who live in rural or urban areas. I know we did look at that in the crosstabs. Jillian, Isa, not sure if there's anything we can share about that.
I think overall, and I think if we maybe if we dug some more, you know, there might be some sort of interesting kind of two-way interactions. But I will overall, somewhat surprisingly, we didn't really see any differences between you know, rural, urban, suburban voters in terms of roll-off. So the rates were among those subgroups largely mirrored the, you know, the same percentages that we were seeing in the overall sample. So that was the, and I would have to go back and look to the crosstabs before I say anything any more specific. But overall, not really differences by geography in that sense.
Yeah, just to add to that really quickly. I mean, first of all, Jillian, when in doubt, go to the crosstabs, right? Totally agree with that. But overall, like the specific demographics that we highlighted during this presentation were ones that popped consistently. So it wasn't just one or two questions where we saw differences across gender or age. It was across the survey in every single question, every single configuration we could think of, right? So like if we control for ideology, if we do, you know, X, Y, Z, for urbanicity, we didn't necessarily see that same difference across all the different questions. So there may have been questions where there were some interesting differences between rural and suburban and urban voters, but it was not consistent enough that it was kind of like worth pulling out from the rest of the sample. There's a lot of data, I think, as both Gaby and Jillian have highlighted, which, you know, we'll definitely share. But yeah, no significant differences, I think, compared to some of the other demographics we discussed today.
Which is interesting in its own right, I think, that's not sort of a huge, oh, my cat came to join me. I don't know when, but there he is. It's not a Zoom unless there's a cat or a baby. No, but that is interesting that there wasn't anything super significant there. There is a question around, in the past, we know that treatments have tiny effects. Yes, very tiny in this world. It seems that with more granular knowledge, the treatment effect has the potential to be much larger with our roll-off voters. What are the expectations of the research team? Well, not to jump into the next phase too much, but you're absolutely right that the effect sizes that we tend to see in political research, like the stuff that we conduct, is very, very small. But again, remember, we're working on these tiny margins, right? And so even a very small effect size can have a huge outcome in the world, much sort of outsized outcome given its actual size. So, but we'll get into that once we're able to report out the findings from the treatments that we've been developing in the more interventional work. Okay, we're running out of time. Quick question: did down ballot include judge races? No. We asked specifically about state ledge to make sure we were getting the clearest message there. And oh my gosh, okay, we have one more minute. Please, yes, cats do make data better. Thank you, Karen. Please do reach out with any questions that I apologize we weren't able to get to. And again, to partner, because I think what we're seeing in the next phase of work, which to eat the dessert first, is some really good findings around messages that will really resonate to empower and excite our voters. And we're eager to partner there and think about ways that we can get that out at scale for the general election. So please do reach out to us. Thank you for joining us. We will follow up with the deck and the top lines memo again. And hope you're off to a wonderful week. Thank you all.